Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics common to both the PowerBasic console and Windows compilers. Today we will look at zip-style compression of files. Today we're going to build a utility to allow us to take a series of files or folders and create a zip file from them. There are a number of free or purchased utilities that can be used to create zip files. However, Windows itself does have the capability to create a zip file from inside your File Explorer. So what we're going to do today is we're going to tap in to the library which Windows uses to create these zip files. The code we're looking at today was originally built way back in 2008 by William Burns. What we're adding to this code is the ability to take command line parameters so we can drive this application externally, and an additional set of error handling. As you will see from the beginning of the code, we've included two libraries. The PB command line include library, which is one we've used before, and a new library called WinShell.include. We're going to generate this include file using the PowerBasic COM Browser, which is something we haven't covered before. This works exactly the same way for the PowerBasic Windows compiler as it does for the console compiler. So although we're using the console compiler today, I'm going to set the code up so that it can be compiled and run either under the Windows compiler or the console compiler. So how do we create this WinShell library? Well, if we go up to our Tools menu, you'll see there is a PowerBasic COM Browser. If we click on that, a dialog appears. Now what we're going to do is we're going to open up the Shell32.dll library, which is a library that contains the code that we're looking for. So if we go into the Windows System 32 folder and we look for Shell, and there is a Shell32.dll. If we open that one up, we'll see that PowerBasic has now generated a code file for you. This large amount of code saves you a great deal of typing. All we have to do is a save as. And we're going to save this as WinShell. And that is our library created. In order to test out our program, I've created two folders. One zip test, which contains a number of folders, some of which have got subdirectories, and zip output. And zip output is where we're going to be creating our zip file. So we will zip up everything inside the zip test folder and we'll create a zip file inside the zip output folder. The command line parameters we're going to pass to this application are going to consist of three paths. With this command line library, we can actually pass in each path individually. It doesn't matter the order you put them in, it just matters on the name. So we're passing in the source, which is where our source folder is that we're going to be zipping. We're passing in the destination, which is the path and the name to the zip file we're going to create. And there is an optional log file. This can be used to create a record of your zipping activities, whether they be successful or unsuccessful. And we'll set up a couple of constants for true and false. As most of the work of the zipping is going to be done within the Shell32 library, this code is not going to be particularly big. However, there are a number of variables we're going to have to create in order to be able to call this library. I'll cover each of these variables as we get to them. But as you will see, some of the variable types are slightly different to the ones we've been using in previous videos. I'm also creating a number of variables to handle our command line parameters. We can capture anything that comes in on the command line quite simply by creating a variable and making it equal to command $. Anything on the command line will automatically be populated into our variable. The command line library we have included has a single function in it. This single function is designed to take your command line and chop it up and populate your variables. This is a very useful way of getting command line parameters coming in. So the call to the function only takes two parameters. The first is the name of the variable, and the second is the value held within the entire command line. And it will pick out from the command line regardless of which order it's in and populate each of these variables. So at this point in the code, we would have the source folder that we wish to zip, the destination folder and name of the zip file we wish to create, and the optional log file, the file and folder into which we want to put our log. Now that we have that in place, the first thing to do is to create an empty zip file using a standard zip file header. First we get a file handle, then we open our destination for output as that file handle, and then we print out one line using the $. The $$ function converts one or more numeric character codes into a string. So this is basically writing one string right to that file and then closing down the file. We're opening this file in a try-catch block, just in case there's any problems with opening the destination. And should there be a problem opening the destination, we're going to write out to our error file. We're populating an error variable with the name of the error. And this piece of code here is a conditional compilation statement. If the PowerBasic constant has been defined, then the compiler will know we're compiling in the console compiler. Otherwise, we're compiling in the Windows compiler. This allows you to handle commands which only operate within one of the compilers. For example, the console commands for stdout will only be functional within the console compiler, and any attempt to compile that line of code in the Windows compiler will generate an error. Whereas the message box command will only compile in the Windows compiler. So using these lines of code allow you to create a piece of source which will compile under either compiler. And this will be used through the rest of the program every time we want to handle an error. In the console compiler, we'll throw a message out to the console. In the Windows compiler, we'll generate a message box. And in addition, if the log file has been defined, we will write out to the log file. So we'll have to create a function to write to the log file. So this fun log function takes two parameters, the name and path of the log file and the text you want to put into the log file. It double checks to make sure that the log file has actually been specified, and then it generates a variable with the date and time. This is using the UK date function. If you're in the US or using a US date format, just replace that with date $. We're then calling a function we've used many times before, the append to file function, which will append this piece of text to the end of the file, if the file already exists. If the file does not exist, it will create the file and write the data to it. So having created our zip file, we now have to populate it. We now want to get an instance of the Windows shell, and we're going to use the anycom statement to do that. Now you'll see the anycom statement has this constant after it, a string constant. Now this is actually coming from the library we generated from the COM browser. Having called this, we need to check to see whether the object was indeed instantiated. We can do this by testing whether the isObject for that particular object is true or false. If it is false, or we have a value in error, then we could not get the Windows shell object to instantiate. This is unlikely, but always possible. And we do exactly as we did before. We've got a conditional compilation line to see if we're running inside the console compiler or the Windows compiler. And if so, we're generating either a console message or a message box, and we're also putting a message out to our log file should it exist. And at that point, if we haven't managed to instantiate this particular object, we are exiting from the function, basically ending the program. So having instantiated that object, what do we do next? Well, we need to assign the source folder to an object so we can actually zip it up. So we're using this variable, which is a variant, to hold the value inside our source folder, which is the path to the folder we wish to zip. We're then populating this object using the namespace with the variant. This sets up our source folder in the object. And again, we need to test to make sure that we manage to instantiate that object quite successfully. So another bit of error checking. Exactly the same approach. We're checking whether the is object for the source folder object is true or false, and logging if it is not. If we get past this bit, we're OK to continue. So now we want to do the same for the target folder. Exactly the same approach. We have a variant variable, we're populating that with a destination, and we are setting up our object to be that variant. And again, if we couldn't get the target folder, we'll log another error. So we get that far, we now have to assign all the items that are in the source folder to an items object. This will recursively look through our source folder and pick up all the items that need to go into the zip file. And just as we did before, we need to check to see whether this object was created or not. Now that we've set everything up, we can now attempt to do the copy. And what we're going to ask Windows to do is to copy all the files from the source folder into the target zip file. And we do this by using the copy here method. This takes all the items we have populated and copies them to the target folder. There are a series of options, and I've put the link to the Microsoft webpage where you can actually pick up these, but we're using option 20, which is the sum of option 4 and option 16. And just as we've done before, we have to test to see whether an error occurred or not. So if we have an error, we'll display it to the user and we'll write it to our log, should the log exist. Point to note here, when we execute the copy here method, this starts a separate thread in Windows to actually perform the copy. No notification is given to the calling program to indicate that the copy has completed. So regardless of how big the zip file is going to become and how many files are going to go into it, the Windows library will return to our code straight away. So we're going to give it a couple of seconds for our code to wait and do nothing before we log completion. So bear this in mind if you're sitting waiting for the zip function to actually complete. If there are a large number of files to be zipped, it may take a few minutes. My purpose in creating this utility is to allow the system to zip up a series of folders and create a series of zip files in the early hours of the morning. So this will be an unattended process. And our last task before we exit this function and this routine is to close off all our interfaces. This will close off all the objects by marking them as nothing, allowing PowerBasic to free up the memory taken up with these objects. So our code compiles quite cleanly. So in order to test this, we need to be able to put this information onto the command line. You'll find in Windows under the Run menu there is a Set command line. This allows you to feed information into your program as if it were coming from the command line. So there is our first parameter, our second, and our final parameter. So we now have all three parameters on our sudo command line. So if we have a look at our output folders, our output folder at the moment is empty. And our zip test folder has 3 folders within it. Each of the folders has files, and one of the folders has a subfolder, which indeed has another subfolder, which has some more files. And in the root of zip testing is going to be created our log. So if we try running our application now, and our application has completed. So if we have a look in our folders, we'll see there is a ziplog.txt file, which is our log file. It has in it the date and time, the word completed, and the zip file which it says it has created. So if we have a look inside our output folder, we will see there indeed is our zip file, If we double click on it, Windows itself will aid us by opening up the zip file and allowing us to look inside it. So we have successfully created a zip file. So to test to make sure that our logging works for any error that comes up, let's try renaming this folder. So if we leave the command line parameters as they are, it will not find the target folder. So if we run the application again now, and have a look at our log, it has now added a message to say there is an error creating the zip file. So putting this kind of error trapping in your code is always a good thing, especially if the application is designed to run unattended. So since our program can either be a console application or a Windows application, both of which can take command line parameters, these programs can be run from batch files, from other applications, or other utilities. They can even be set up as scheduled tasks if you have the need to zip up folders every evening and copy them to somewhere safe. Hopefully you'll find this utility useful, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.